Dovrebbe essere già acceso. Buongiorno, grazie per essere con noi. Thank you so much for being here today. Marina Fabbri,
Giorgio Gosetti
vi danno il benvenuto come direzione del Noir in Festival, ma in realtà oggi siamo quasi degli apriportone, perché questa è casa nostra, è casa di questo festival, ma è soprattutto la casa dell'Università IULM di Milano.
È con grande piacere che abbiamo accolto l'invito di premiare il nostro autore con il premio più prestigioso che il Noir in Festival ormai da più di 30 anni consegna a un maestro del genere, alla sua carriera, alla sua importanza per il genere. L'invito che ci è stato appunto offerto dalla rettrice Valentina Garavaglia e dal vicerettore Fabio Vittorini di organizzare qui insieme a voi questo premio per noi così importante.
E quindi la parola per salutare Mick Herron spetta in primo luogo alla rettrice dell'Università IULM. Vorrei che avessimo con noi su questo palcoscenico il prorettore dell'Università Fabio Vittorini, lo OBE e CEO di Film London Adrian Wootton, ovviamente Mick Herron, e grazie a Carla Bellucci che lo accompagna, e lasciamo volentieri la parola alla rettrice.
Grazie. Puoi accomodarti e poi scendi con me? Bene. Bene, grazie. Grazie di cuore, grazie al Noir, al Festival, grazie a Giorgio Gosetti, a Marina Fabbri, grazie al professor Fabio Vittorini per aver fatto accadere questo evento in IULM. Sono davvero felice di dare il benvenuto nel nostro Ateneo ad Adrian Wootton e Mick Herron, e tra poco avrò l'onore di insignire del prestigioso Raymond Chandler Award, questo riconoscimento che dal 1988 celebra i grandi maestri della narrativa noir e della spy story. È un piacere aver condiviso con voi, e non solo con voi e noi qui presenti, ma con tutti gli studenti che hanno partecipato a questo festival, che è diventato davvero un leitmotiv per questa università. Abbiamo costruito un rapporto nel tempo solido, capace di generare cultura, dialogo, nuove visioni, laboratori. Grazie. Il tema della scrittura e dell'audiovisivo sono parte viva della nostra identità accademica, dalla narrativa alla sceneggiatura, dal cinema al teatro, fino ai percorsi professionalizzanti dei nostri master. E per questo il Festival del Noir si rinnova insieme a noi anno dopo anno e ci dà davvero carica ed energia in queste direzioni. Ho preparato poche righe per presentare questo grande maestro, questo autore che ha rinnovato con eleganza e ironia il romanzo di spionaggio contemporaneo. Ve le leggo perché siano un frammento di una motivazione ben più ampia del premio che gli consegniamo oggi. Herron debutta nel 2003 con Down Cemetery Road, primo titolo della serie dedicata alla detective privata Zoe Boehm. Nel 2010 inaugura la saga che lo renderà noto al pubblico internazionale, aperta con Slow Horses, un covo di bastardi, storia di agenti dell'MI5 messi ai margini, falliti, dimenticati, con Dead Lions, in bocca al lupo, pubblicato nel 2013, conquista il Gold Dagger Award della Crime Writers Association e il massimo riconoscimento inglese per il romanzo giallo. Nel 2024 viene eletto Fellow della Royal Society of Literature, una delle più antiche istituzioni letterarie del Regno Unito. E Slow Horses è stato inserito dal Daily Telegraph tra le 20 migliori spy novel di tutti i tempi. e nel 2025 gli è stato attribuito il Diamond Dagger Award, lo stesso premio vinto da Le Carré, omaggiando una carriera esemplare. Dal 2022 questa serie diventa un successo televisivo globale ed è prodotta da Apple TV. Per tutto questo, per la qualità della scrittura, per aver dato nuova linfa al noir e allo spionaggio contemporaneo, per la forza dei suoi personaggi nell'ambito del Noir in Festival, sono davvero lieta di conferire a Mick Herron, insieme a Marina Fabbri e a Giorgio Gosetti, il Raymond Chandler Award 2025, un premio che il Festival assegna a un maestro che, come Herron, con le proprie opere e con riconosciuta maestria, esplora le dinamiche del vivere contemporaneo e ne racconta gli aspetti più complessi. Complimenti da me e da tutta la Yulm.
Prima che Mick Herron dica le sue parole, volevo aggiungere un'informazione sul premio. Fisicamente il premio rappresenta il brushed doubloon, una moneta del Settecento che è il MacGuffin, diciamo, di uno dei romanzi di Chandler, The High Windows. E noi lo abbiamo riprodotto in argento e questo è appunto il segno del Raymond Chandler Award.
Buongiorno, grazie. I can barely express how delighted I am to be here at Noir in Milan, or how proud I am to receive this award. I'm deeply grateful to all those who saw fit to present me with the Raymond Chandler Award, this wonderful brasher doubloon, and I'll treasure it always. In an odd turn of circumstance, it was in fact my Latin teacher at school, way back in the 1970s, who encouraged me to read Chandler. So Joe Meadows is the first of those I have to thank for putting me here today. Joe departed this life many years ago, but he was one of life's misfits, a lover of the classics and a devotee of noir fiction. But the two are not entirely incompatible. Both denote a delight in language, whether this language was wielded by the poets of the Golden Age or the hard-boiled writers of the 30s and 40s, tapping on typewriters in smoke-filled rooms. I think Joe would have been equally at home in the Rome of Virgil's day or the Los Angeles of Chandler's era, but particularly the latter, as Joe was a champion smoker.
Buongiorno a tutti, posso solo tentare di esprimere quanto sono felice di questo premio ed esprimere tutta la mia gratitudine e il fatto che sono molto orgoglioso di riceverlo, visto che è intitolato a Raymond Chandler. Questo brusher doubloon è un oggetto che custodirò con molto amore e con molta cura. È stato il mio insegnante di latino negli anni 70 che mi ha, come dire, introdotto per la prima volta al genere noir, Joe Meadows, al quale sarò sempre grato. E lui è il responsabile del fatto che io sia qui con voi oggi. In effetti era il mio insegnante, appunto. Le lettere classiche e la letteratura noir sembrano incompatibili, ma non lo sono. La letteratura classica usa un linguaggio dell'epoca d'oro e la letteratura noir invece comunque ha un linguaggio moderno, attuale, quello degli scrittori appunto classici del noir degli anni 30 e 40 come Chandler.
As for what Chandler has come to mean to me in the years since, he is quite simply the father of all private detective novelists, the writer who demonstrated that literary value is not the sole preserve of so-called literary fiction. that literature can be wrought from base metals, and that some of the profoundest stories we tell about ourselves come to us disguised as mysteries. Because after all, what is life but a mystery, one we hope to understand come the final page?
Quindi appunto questo premio che è intitolato a Chandler che è il padre di tutta la letteratura di genere, di questo genere, del noir, e che ha un grande valore letterario, perché il grande valore letterario non è soltanto della narrativa classica, della narrativa tout court, è anche fatta di vile metallo talvolta, ed è una narrativa, quella del noir, che parla della vita, parla del mistero, e quindi la vita è un grande mistero.
In his own explorations of life and how it should be lived, Chandler famously wrote that down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, neither tarnished nor afraid. While it's true that my own novels frequently wander down streets that are notably mean, I'm not sure that the characters these streets are peopled with live up to his exhortation. Jackson Lamb, for example, is mean, and he's certainly tarnished, not to mention nicotine-stained. And I suspect that there's fear in there too, somewhere, because he's a clever man, and clever people are frequently afraid. It takes a peculiarly blinkered mindset not to feel fear in the 21st century. But Chandler, I hope, would have embraced at least this attempt to create a rounded fictional world. He was not too keen on the cosy end of the English crime fiction spectrum, where well-mannered killers leave bodies in tidy libraries. And he would, I think, have recognised that those of us who strive to create character and to weave our plots from the fabric that the outside world offers us are at least engaging with literary ambition, however far we might fall short of his own creative genius. So I'd like to think that he's smiling down on us on this occasion, or if not smiling, at least smoking.
Appunto il noir, Chandler, con questa esplorazione della vita, dei bassifondi, della vita dei bassifondi, della vita vera dell'uomo della strada, e a questi personaggi così apparentemente vili appartiene Jackson Lamb, che è appunto è un personaggio segnato dalla vita, che ha dei modi volgari, però è un uomo intelligente, è un uomo che ha paura di alcune cose, e come non avere paura di alcune cose nel mondo di oggi. Quindi non è questo protagonista dei miei romanzi non è da paragonare con quelli invece delle storie classiche di spionaggio, che, come dire, sono dall'altro lato dello spettro, con le loro vite un po' perfette, sempre di successo, e che hanno animato la letteratura di genere del crime che conosciamo. Quindi lui è perfettamente a suo agio, Lamb, in queste, di essere com'è, e forse in questo momento sorriderebbe di noi.
No one can find a readership in a foreign language without the assistance, indeed the collaboration, of a fine translator. So I'd like to thank Alfredo Colito for bringing my work to Italian readers' attention. How he has managed to convey what I feel is a very English sense of humour, not to mention some presumably untranslatable puns, and indeed some very filthy jokes, into your beautiful language is beyond me. I only hope that the process hasn't left him feeling, in Chandler's words, too weak to crawl over a worm. So thank you, Alfredo. I hope he's prepared to carry on with this task, and that he's not yet feeling as empty as a scarecrow's pockets, because I haven't finished yet.
È una grande soddisfazione sapere di avere dei lettori anche in altre lingue, e in questa occasione vorrei ringraziare il mio traduttore italiano Alfredo Pollito per l'eccellente lavoro che ha svolto, gli sono davvero molto grato, che senza di lui non mi conoscereste. E davvero ho apprezzato molto il suo lavoro nella capacità di tradurre l'umorismo che c'è nei giochi di parole, anche il linguaggio, diciamo, volgare che c'è nei romanzi. E Chandler, appunto, anche Chandler avrebbe apprezzato molto il suo lavoro.
Because although this delightful award is given in token of a lifetime achievement, I'd like to think there are still some achievements ahead of me. I'm only 62, and if the grace of the world allows, there'll be more books to come. But meantime, I'd like to offer my heartfelt gratitude to those who've seen fit to bestow the Raymond Chandler Award upon me, to the organisers of this wonderful festival, which I'm enjoying so much, and who have made me feel so welcome, to the city of Milan itself, which is beautiful, to my lovely partner Joe, who makes all things possible for me, and to all of you, new friends and old, who are here today. Thank you all.
Dicevo prima che ci saranno altri libri, continuerò a scrivere, quindi avrò bisogno della collaborazione dei miei traduttori, e visto che questo premio è dedicato diciamo, all'impegno, al mio lavoro di scrittore di una vita, appunto vi prometto che ci saranno altri libri per il futuro, e voglio esprimere ancora la mia gratitudine per ricevere questo premio così prestigioso e il mio ringraziamento al Noir Festival, nel quale che mi sono goduto moltissimo, in cui sono stato accolto con grande apertura, con grande affetto, e anche il piacere di essere in una città come Milano. Quindi vi ringrazio ancora.
Nel dare la parola al prorettore Fabio Vittorini, che insieme a Adrian Wootton poi converserà prima ancora di Adrian con Mick Herron, voglio ricordare al pubblico una cosa che probabilmente chi frequenta questa università sa benissimo, e cioè che c'è un QR code attraverso il quale scaricare l'app oppure leggere la possibilità, nella seconda parte di questo incontro, che sarà in consecutiva nel dialogo fra Adrian Wootton e Mick Herron, per poter seguire in simultanea la traduzione, grazie a Carla Bellucci, che come vedete è una etrina, adesso sta in palcoscenico, poi sarà in cabina di traduzione, insomma fa tutto, e la ringraziamo molto.
Allora, io ringrazio ormai per la terza volta nell'arco di questo evento i direttori del festival, quindi Giorgio Cosetti e Marina Fabbri, per la fatica immane che si fa nell'organizzare non solo questo evento ma un intero festival fatto di tantissimi eventi, tantissime iniziative, con tanti linguaggi che vengono contaminati, attraversati, eccetera. Quindi la prima parte di questo dialogo con Mick Herron sarà fatta da me in italiano con traduzione consecutiva, dopodiché se volete sentire la traduzione della seconda parte c'è l'app di cui parlava Giorgio Cosetti. Io inizierei con una domanda a Mick Herron di questo tipo. Nel 2010, che è l'anno in cui esce Slow Horses, il primo romanzo della sua serie, fortunatissima, su un giornale, esattamente sul The Globe and Mail, esce questa dichiarazione di un giornalista che adesso leggo, che è curiosa perché è una curiosa coincidenza ed c'è un curioso cortocircuito. Dice: è forse lo scrittore vivente che conosce meglio quello che succede dietro le quinte della politica della forza e dell'oligarchia globale. Anche se in Gran Bretagna è considerato un maestro, probabilmente i soliti pregiudizi sprezzanti sui romanzi di spionaggio non gli faranno avere tutti i riconoscimenti che merita. Il suo successo sta nel combinare strutture narrative essenziali con un orecchio straordinario per il dialogo, avvolgendo il tutto in una comprensione degli eventi contemporanei che per la maggior parte dei comuni mortali è frammentata. Questo è Misha Glenny, lascio il tempo alla traduttrice di tradurre, questo è Misha Glenny che scrive un articolo su John le Carré nel 2010. Io volevo chiedere a Mick Herron, la cui ammirazione per John le Carré abbiamo sentito anche prima, insomma è conclamata, è stata dichiarata più volte, eccetera. un po' come la si ha verso un maestro di questo genere, no? Il genere della spy story. Volevo chiedergli se nella sua esperienza di scrittore di spy stories, anche lui con una sfasatura di un po' di decenni, si è dovuto misurare con i pregiudizi che a volte anche il mondo accademico stesso ha, il mondo intellettuale, nei confronti della letteratura di genere, in questo caso della spy story, che per alcuni è un genere di consumo. Mi chiedo se si è dovuto mai confrontare con questo tipo di pregiudizi.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you. Hello. Yes and no. I have faced the prejudice that has often greeted genre fiction of all types. While it's true that the mainstream literary establishment in the UK, in England especially, has often looked down on crime fiction in all its forms, those who do admire the genre have always been aware that there have been great writers operating within it. And John le Carré obviously was one of the finest. He was certainly recognised during his lifetime as one of the great English novelists of the time, and his novel A Perfect Spy was greeted as one of the great English novels of the post-war years. But it also, I mean, since then, in the past decade or more, that prejudice has been being worn away a bit, I think, and that even in general terms, mainstream fiction is accepting that many of the finest novelists at work are working within that stream now. And indeed, we're seeing mainstream novelists like John Banville, for instance, writing crime fiction, initially under a pseudonym and now under his own name. I think that measures the slow acceptance of crime fiction into the mainstream of literary achievement. One of the reasons why mainstream novelists are quite keen on writing within the genre now is that they make a lot more money doing that. Because for readers, crime fiction has always been one of the most popular of the genres and has always outsold, not always, but for a long time, has outsold most other forms of genre fiction. And on the continent, particularly in Italy and in France, crime fiction has always been greeted with a great deal of respect as well as affection.
Rispondo alla sua domanda sì e no, sul fatto di dovermi confrontare con un pregiudizio verso il genere noir. Però è vero che sicuramente la letteratura mainstream ha sempre guardato con sufficienza agli scrittori di genere, ma comunque ormai si è molto consapevoli del fatto che ci sono grandissimi scrittori di genere come le Carré, che è considerato tout court un grande scrittore quando è uscito con il suo A Perfect Spy, insomma è considerato un grande romanziere tout court. Negli ultimi 10 anni questo pregiudizio mi sembra che sia però scemato, perché sono usciti dei romanzi di genere di grande valore, anche dei romanzieri non di genere come John Banville hanno iniziato a scrivere crime fiction, prima con uno pseudonimo e poi con il loro vero nome, e immagino che il motivo per cui scrittori scrittori di questo tipo cominciano a scrivere invece crime, polizieschi, eccetera, è perché si guadagna molto di più. Naturalmente questi libri vendono più degli altri e tra i lettori questa letteratura è diventata molto, molto popolare, molto, molto amata, e devo dire che nel continente, specialmente in Francia, questo genere è un genere molto amato che gode anche di grande rispetto e di affezione da parte dei lettori.
Magari dopo farete con Adrian Wootton una riflessione anche su come l'adattamento seriale può avere in qualche modo, gli adattamenti seriali in genere possono avere laicizzato anche l'approccio dell'Accademia rispetto alla letteratura di genere. Magari ne parliamo dopo. Invece volevo fare una domanda diretta appunto su Jackson Lamb, che lo stesso Mick Herron ha descritto prima in maniera colorita, così come viene descritto in maniera colorita nei suoi romanzi. Leggo, è l'ultima, lo giuro, un'altra piccola citazione da un giornalista che si chiama Mark Lawson, pubblicata su The Guardian quando è uscito London Rules, che è l'ultimo romanzo, che diciamo è l'ultimo romanzo di questa serie, che è stato appena pubblicato da Feltrinelli, che viene presentato oggi pomeriggio a Casa Manzoni. Quindi è in uscita da noi, ma in originale è uscito qualche anno fa. Allora, in occasione di quell'uscita, Lawson scrive: questo è il quinto romanzo della serie Jackson Lamb di Mick Herron, che per caratterizzazione e tono è essenzialmente una scatenata sovversione di libri di John le Carré. Ancora torna John le Carré su George Smiley, che è il protagonista dei romanzi di le Carré. Mentre Smiley è il genio umano dei servizi britannici e il suo peggior vizio è leggere poesie tedesche in originale, la spia principale di Herron, Lamb, è un bigotto filisteo, morbosamente obeso, spettacolarmente flatulento, alcolista e fumatore accanito. Vorrei chiedere a Herron se riconosce in questa descrizione la descrizione che lui farebbe del suo protagonista. Però vorrei anche chiedergli questo. A un certo punto Lamb, in questo romanzo, dice che il comportamento etico equivale a mettere una vajazzle, che per chi non lo sapesse è una decorazione che si mette una decorazione fatta di strass o di lustrini che si mette sulla zona pubblica delle donne, è un'immagine un po' curiosa. Dice: il comportamento etico è come mettere una vajazzle su una suora. Quindi bello da immaginare, ma chi ne beneficia davvero? Questo si chiede il protagonista del romanzo. Ora, io chiedo a Herron, questa caratterizzazione del protagonista di questa serie come un protagonista appunto che sta fuori dagli schemi, che fa cose socialmente poco accettabili, mettiamola così, no? E che non ha quei vizi nobilissimi che invece avevano i suoi predecessori, come il leggere poesie in tedeschino originale. Se questa cosa sia da ricondurre un po' a una tendenza della narrativa contemporanea, e non solo quella letteraria, ma tantissimo anche quella seriale, di centrare i racconti su quello che comunemente adesso viene chiamato l'antieroe, piuttosto che non su un eroe con il quale identificarsi in maniera nobilitante come accadeva in passato.
I never consciously set out to write an anti-hero in Lamb. What I was trying to do and continue to try to do is to write novels that are very definitely set in the here and now. When le Carré was writing the great Smiley novels, he was in many ways writing about the end of empire and how England was struggling, trying to find its role in the post-war years. And there was a kind of austerity and melancholy about his writing because of that, because it was appropriate to the times that he was writing in and about. London Rules was written in 2016, just after the referendum that took the United Kingdom out of Europe, the Brexit referendum. The result of that referendum was a great shock to many of us. I think it was a shock to people who voted for it, in fact. I was not one of those people. And to me, writing novels in which there is absurdity at their heart and a certain amount of chaos and incompetence perfectly reflect the United Kingdom as it is in 2016 and since, because we made a huge error when we voted to come out of Europe, and we've not yet managed to catch up with ourselves. We still don't quite know what we're doing. So my anti-hero is simply appropriate to the times that we're living in. He's quite gross, yes, and he is emblematic of a kind of the wheels having come off, really, of nobody really knowing who's in charge. And that, I suppose, that is what I am aiming for when I write him. I'm not trying to create a particular form of anti-hero or somebody who is in direct response to what the character that Le Carré created. I'm simply trying to write about a man who is aware of the enormous amounts of nonsense that are going on, and maybe trying to retain a little bit of stability right in the middle of it.
No, non ho, diciamo, consapevolmente pensato a creare un anti-hero creando il personaggio di Lamb. Quello che ho cercato di fare è quello di scrivere dei romanzi che fossero radicati nel qui e ora. Le Carré, nei suoi romanzi che hanno come protagonista Smiley, scriveva in un'epoca che era la fine dell'impero britannico e quindi in cui l'Inghilterra cercava di capire quale fosse il suo ruolo dopo la seconda guerra mondiale, e quindi quello che lui scrive, questo personaggio di Smiley, il profilo di Smiley, è assolutamente appropriato per il tempo in cui Le Carré scrive. London Rules, le regole di Londra, l'ultimo romanzo pubblicato in Italia, è del 2016 e l'ho scritto dopo il tragico referendum per la Brexit. Il risultato è stato uno shock non solo per quelli che non l'avevano votato, ma anche per quelli che avevano votato per la Brexit. È un'assurdità con cui noi dobbiamo adesso convivere, dovuta all'incompetenza e al caos che ha regnato, appunto, e tuttora regna in Inghilterra dal 2016 fino a oggi, e non siamo ancora riusciti a uscire da questa impasse. Quindi ritengo che il personaggio di Lamb sia appropriato per i tempi che corrono. Sì, Lamb è una persona volgare, ma è emblematica del fatto che in questo momento non si capisce chi è che comanda, chi è che ha la responsabilità del comando. E quindi non ho cercato di creare in modo particolare un antieroe, come magari risposta invece all'eroe, agli eroi di Le Carré. È semplicemente Lamb un uomo che è consapevole dell'assurdità e del caos dei nostri tempi, e quindi è questo che ho voluto fare.
Per spezzare una lancia a favore di Jackson Lamb, dirò che il punto d'incontro nei primi romanzi di tutto il gruppo, di tutta questa gang di smandrappati, è la tomba di William Blake nel cimitero di... Insomma, credo che qualcosa voglia significare comunque.
La tomba di William Blake dove?
Yes. A Londra.
In London. The focal point of the novels is the tomb of William Blake in London.
It is. Blake's grave is very near where I was working in London for many years, and I used to visit it at lunchtime. I used to go and sit there. It's not actually the actual grave. They don't know where it is. There's a stone saying, "Not far from here lies the remains of William Blake and his wife." And I never visited it without finding fresh flowers having been laid on it. There are people who still love William Blake centuries later. I'm one of them.
Sì, è vero, appunto lavoravo lì vicino a dove si trova appunto la tomba di William Blake, che in realtà non è proprio una tomba, c'è una lapide che dice da queste parti qui vicino sono sepolti William Blake e sua moglie, e tuttora ci sono ogni giorno dei fiori freschi su questa tomba. Dopo secoli, e molte persone ci vanno, me compreso.
La verità è che Jackson Lamb è un eroe o antieroe, come lo vogliamo chiamare, assolutamente irresistibile, ma detto questo volevo chiedere altre due cose velocissime a Mick Herron. La prima è questa. Nei suoi romanzi c'è una cosa che colpisce, che a me ha colpito tantissimo, è la capacità straordinaria nella costruzione dei dialoghi, che sono veramente fulminanti, che sono da un lato una mimesi potentissima del parlato vero e dall'altro hanno la capacità di mettere dentro diciamo, quelle dinamiche del botta e risposta tipiche dell'umorismo inglese, che a volte sono davvero fulminanti. La domanda è, ammesso che si possa rispondere davvero, che ci possa rispondere davvero, ha una tecnica, cioè ha un modello, ha una procedura con la quale costruisce i suoi dialoghi, il parlato nei suoi romanzi?
Thank you, Fabio. For me, dialogue is really at the heart of the novels, both the ones that I like to read and the ones that I try to write. I think it's because, for me, character comes most alive when they're talking to each other. And I find that when I'm creating a new character, either on paper or in my mind when I'm thinking about them, I have a very vague outline of who they are and what they might be like. And it's only once I put them on the page and have them talking to other characters that they start to feel real to me and they start to come alive on the page. I don't entirely know why this is. I just think that the novel is all about communication. You know, the writer is communicating to the reader and the characters are communicating with each other, and dialogue is the most obvious, the mode of communication open to almost all of us. So that's where we feel that we're at our most expressive, I suppose. The one difficulty I have with dialogue, I always found that dialogue is the most difficult thing to write when you're learning to be a writer. It's the most difficult thing, and then suddenly it becomes the easiest once you know how to do it. There's a trick of it, and I think for all writers the trick of it is probably a bit different, but when a writer has discovered how to do dialogue, that becomes very easy. And then the danger is that you do too much of it. So for me, writing the very heavy dialogue scenes that I write them quite long, and then I have to take out as much as possible. Otherwise they would become intolerably long.
Sì, per me il dialogo è proprio il cuore del romanzo, della scrittura, perché mi piace leggere i dialoghi negli altri autori e mi piace crearli io. I personaggi diventano più vivi, cioè sono veramente vivi quando parlano, quando hanno un dialogo con qualcuno, e quando creo un nuovo personaggio, sia sulla carta oppure soltanto lo immagino, ho un'immagine piuttosto, come dire, ho in mente un vago schizzo del personaggio, ma il personaggio diventa veramente vivo quando comincia a parlare, si definisce quando comincia a parlare con gli altri personaggi, allora che sembra davvero reale, sembra vivo sulla pagina. E questo ha a che fare con l'importanza della comunicazione, no? Sia verso il lettore sia tra un personaggio e l'altro, ed è proprio, come dire, alla radice della nostra necessità di esprimerci, no? È il momento in cui diciamo si è più espressivi nel dialogo. I dialoghi sono la cosa più difficile da scrivere, però una volta che si è capito come farli diventa facile, diventa una buona cosa. Però c'è un però, nel senso che siccome è facile poi scrivere dialoghi, si cade nella trappola di scriverne troppo di dialogo, appunto di esagerare col dialogo. Quindi io di solito scrivo dei dialoghi molto lunghi, ma poi cerco di togliere il più possibile per non esagerare.
Un'ultima domanda, poi cedo la parola a Adrian Wootton per il seguito della conversazione. Una domanda ovvia, direi. La serie di Slow House è diventata una serie TV di grande successo che si chiama Slow Horses, che è diffusa da Apple TV Plus, e la domanda è, anzi sono due domande. La prima è, dato che la scrittura di Herron è una scrittura estremamente visiva, molto parlata, con un montaggio, diciamo, di sequenze narrative veloce, che è molto cinematico, quindi davvero pronto per essere adattato, no? La domanda è: pensava, quando ha cominciato a scrivere il primo romanzo della serie e poi anche i successivi, prima che questa serie venisse appunto adattata per lo schermo, diciamo, che sarebbe potuto accadere? Cioè c'era in qualche modo un'attenzione di background sul fatto che quel racconto sarebbe potuto diventare un racconto audiovisivo? E poi, agganciata a questa, una domandaccia, gli chiedo se è soddisfatto dell'adattamento, cioè se la serie TV rispetta lo spirito dei suoi romanzi, se gli piace, insomma.
Thank you. I'd start by saying, yes, I'm delighted with the TV show. I think they're doing a lovely job. And I think that Gary Oldman in particular is just fabulous. But I've been very fortunate to have one of the greatest character actors in the world today being on screen performing this character. So, yes, how could I not be pleased? But I've never written with screen images in mind, and I don't write with pictures in my head. I've always written as a writer. I write to the page. I work in sentences and vocabulary. And I've never had a mental image of what any of my characters look like. I've always been writing to the voices in my head. So I've managed to maintain them. They're still the same as ever they were. And although for the past few years I have been watching the screen versions of these stories, I don't think about the actors when I'm writing. I continue to write to them as they exist at the back of my mind somewhere. So I don't think that that has changed for me. Readers might feel differently. In many ways, I'd be the last to know, I think. But I've often thought that writers of my generation, and indeed a bit older, those of us who grew up with television screens and cinema, have almost unconsciously adopted cinematic techniques in writing, particularly in writing action sequences. So the editing of an action sequence on the page, consciously or not, seems to imitate the way these scenes would be shown on screen. And I've always thought that that was how that had developed. And then I read somewhere that Cecil B. DeMille, when talking about having directed The Birth of a Nation, a very contentious film to discuss now, said that when he was planning how to film these scenes, he took the techniques from Charles Dickens. So in fact, cinema has borrowed from the written word and has done right from the beginning. So it's a very circular sort of relationship. I do think that the screenwriters of Slow Horses have done a wonderful job with the books, but they have had to change a lot because I'm a writer, and when I'm writing, I'm mostly inside my characters' heads, and they have to show what's happening in the outside world. So there's always going to be that gap there. And I'm very glad of that gap. I think that for me, the books are the end product. I'm a novelist, and I write a novel and it's published, and that is it for me. I'm thoroughly thrilled to see a TV show based on those books, but that's not why I do it.
Beh, prima di tutto voglio dire sì, sono contento, molto soddisfatto di come sono le serie TV. Credo che abbiano fatto un ottimo lavoro. E Gary Oldman è favoloso e mi ritengo molto fortunato di il mio personaggio sia stato impersonato da uno dei più grandi caratteristi del cinema. Comunque, per rispondere alla sua domanda, no, non scrivo con delle immagini in testa, delle scene che immagino. Io non scrivo pensando a una scena cinematografica o a una sequenza. La mia scrittura, cioè io mi concentro sulle frasi, sul vocabolario, sulla scrittura in sé e quindi non so come sono esteticamente questi personaggi, questi che io creo, sono solo delle voci che io ho nella testa e quindi la loro versione cinematografica non è la mia, insomma, non è quello che io, cioè non è necessariamente quello che ho pensato, e quindi non penso agli attori, anche se ho cominciato a vedere la serie quando ancora, cioè la serie è cominciata che io continuavo a scrivere i romanzi, non penso agli attori quando continuo a scrivere dei personaggi che loro interpretano, e quindi non è cambiato niente per me, non sono stato influenzato dagli attori che interpretano i miei personaggi, ma comunque ho pensato penso anche questa cosa, che gli scrittori della mia età o anche diciamo delle generazioni precedenti sono cresciuti comunque con immagini televisive o cinematografiche, cioè sono cresciuti con questi nuovi mezzi e quasi inconsciamente adottano nella scrittura un taglio magari cinematografico, una tecnica di montaggio delle sequenze, quindi è qualcosa diciamo che ormai fa parte di noi. Però voglio ricordare quello che disse una volta Cecil B. DeMille parlando del suo attualmente controverso film La nascita di una nazione, The Birth of a Nation. Disse che rispondendo alla domanda come pianificava le sequenze del film, immaginava appunto il montaggio del film, e lui disse che prendeva questo dalla tecnica usata da Charles Dickens nei suoi romanzi. Quindi diciamo che il cerchio si chiude, ecco, c'è una certa circolarità in questo, e sicuramente il cinema ha cambiato molto, però io scrivo nella testa, cioè, però è diverso il cinema dalla scrittura ovviamente nella resa, perché come scrittore io sono nella testa dei miei personaggi, ma al cinema loro devono mostrare quello che succede fuori dalla testa di queste persone, cioè l'azione, no? E quindi per me il libro è il prodotto finale, quindi quello che accade dopo è come se non mi riguardasse più.
Solo una battuta e poi cedo la parola a Marina Fabbri. Dicevo, è interessante il fatto che, lo dico da studioso di letteratura con un pizzico di compiacimento, dico, è interessante che quando si parla di tecniche narrative anche al cinema, anche nella serialità, si finisce sempre a cerchi stretti o larghi a parlare di Charles Dickens.
Grazie Fabio Vittorini. Un applauso. E se si parla di Charles Dickens si parla in Inghilterra di Adrian Wootton. Due parole per presentare per noi un carissimo amico, ma un'autorità appunto nel campo di Dickens, su cui ha tenuto conferenze in tutto il mondo nel corso del bicentenario, adesso non ricordo quando sia caduto, ma insomma qualche anno fa, su Dickens, e quindi sul rapporto tra Dickens e il cinema è piuttosto ferrato. Adrian Wootton è CEO di Film London, che è attualmente l'organismo governativo britannico che si occupa della promozione del cinema e soprattutto della produzione internazionale del cinema in Inghilterra. Adrian Wootton è stato direttore del London Film Festival, BFI, ha diretto anche dei festival di letteratura noir, è un grandissimo esperto di letteratura crime, oltre che di cinema e di film noir, come noi e anche voi avete ormai imparato a conoscere, visto che ha fatto diverse masterclass qui in Yulm, non ultima a quella appunto dell'altro ieri sul rapporto tra il cinema noir e il musical. Naturalmente è un grande appassionato delle serie TV, è un grande conoscitore di Mick Herron, e in qualche modo dobbiamo anche a lui, insomma, se Mick Herron è con noi oggi. Quindi io cederei la parola fra poco a Adrian Wootton, non prima di appunto aver visto una clip che Giorgio ci presenta.
Allora, si abbasseranno le luci e vi racconteremo il mondo di Slow Horses e Down Cemetery Road attraverso i trailer che annunciano queste due serie di Apple Plus TV. Subito dopo la parola a Adrian Wootton e Mick Herron.
Well, we'll come back to talking about both those series, but first of all, congratulations, Mick, on the Raymond Chandler Award. That's fantastic. It's lovely you're here with us, and thank you to Marina and Giorgio and Fabio and everybody for organising this, and it's lovely to be part of it. We're going to talk. Hang on, is that on? Yeah, we're going to talk about the television series and about your more recent work. But I want to go back to the beginning, because I think it's interesting, because there's students here, and you've talked a little bit about Dickens, you've referred to Le Carré, you've obviously talked in that beautiful acceptance speech about Chandler. But when you had your classics teacher you referred to there, what was the first thing that made your kind of heart quicken in terms of reading? What was the inspiration? Was it Dickens first? Was it reading Chandler? Was it reading Ian Fleming? Was there a particular author or series of authors that you really kind of inspired you and made you even dimly think, I want to do this?
I mean, many authors have become important to me over the course of my reading life, but I think what really made the difference was that my reading life started very early. My mother was a nursery school teacher, and she taught me to read before I went to school, before I went to primary school. I was most of the way to reading then. So stories had always been hugely important to me as I was growing up. I was one of 6, so it was a big family, and my memory, it's probably a fake memory, but my memory of childhood was a very busy family life going on when I'd be sitting under a table reading a book. And I think that having grown up with stories, the urge was just to take part in that. It was no individual author. As I say, individual authors came to be very important to me later on, but in the beginning, it was simply that world of story, that world of fiction that I could disappear inside as a reader. And disappearing inside it as a writer became just a natural progression. There was very little conscious decision about it, really. I just realised I was a writer, I think.
But in realising you were a writer, because I think this is very important, because I know people get asked all the time, and certainly distinguished writers like yourself get asked all the time, is that what do you said earlier in the conversation, you talked about learning the trick, for example, of dialogue, it being really hard and really, until you then learned how to do it, and then it became easier. I'm just wondering, when you actually started writing, did you start at school? Did you start at university? When was it that you started practicing every day and thinking, this is what I've got to do?
It was a slow and staggered progress, I think. Like very, very many people, I think probably the majority of people, I did write stories as a young person, and then early, as a child and as a young teenager, I would write fiction. I would write short stories, and then that stopped mid-teens, I think. And again, I think this is extremely common. This is what people do when they're growing up. They find other things to interest them. I don't need to tell you what those other things are, but we all discover them for ourselves, if we're lucky, around about 16, if we're unlucky, much later than that. And so for a few years, I did stop. And it was at college, at university years, that I started again. But when I started again, I was writing poetry. I discovered the joys of verse by then, and spent quite a few years writing poems. I published in small magazines. I never published a collection at all. But I found that they came quite slowly, and they were a lot of work. And I sort of waited for them to happen. I didn't learn the knack of working at poetry. So it sort of dried up for me. And at that point, once I realised I'd gone for, a year without writing a poem, I thought, I've got to do something else with this need, this creative need within me. So that's when I started writing prose. And I knew that if I was going to do that, I would have to be doing it every day. It would have to be a routine. There would have to be rules involved. So at that point, it would have been my mid-20s, I think, I started writing every day. At that point, I had a job, and I would write in the evenings when I came back from work. And I think now, looking back on it, if I'd realised that routine was an important part of the process and had applied that earlier, I wouldn't be here now, certainly, but I would be somewhere writing poems,
right? Probably
which nobody would be reading, but that's what I would be doing.
And at what point, because obviously the novels which we just seen an extract a little bit from the television series, they're not published yet in Italy, but the Down Cemetery Road novels. At what point did you start writing that first? Was that the first novel, or was that the first published novel?
It was the first published novel. It was the first successful novel in the sense that it was the first one that I felt okay about showing to anybody else. And I think that was largely due to the fact that it was the first time that I'd created a character that I felt comfortable with. And that was the character of Sarah. Zoe, in fact, only appears in quite small doses in that first novel. She reappears in later novels. So that first book, for me, really was about Sarah. And it's the only one of my novels that has been drastically rewritten. The first version of it that I wrote essentially had a different plot.
Oh, really?
It had the same characters and a lot of the same events happening within it, but there was a different engine at the centre of it, which didn't work. So I sort of took that out and put a different engine in. And that taught me a big lesson, I think, looking back on it now, which is that when you're writing a novel, the plot is perhaps the least important part of it, because you can replace all those bits. But character is what a novel is about, and you have to get that right before worrying about anything else.
And obviously that's the lesson, you, as you say, you learnt, because over the course of those 4 novels, Zoe becomes much more important. And Sarah comes back, but Zoe becomes the detective kind of centre of those novels. But did you feel as you were writing them, they were published and you were starting to get some attention, and they're set in Oxford, they are detective novels, they're not espionage novels in the way that Slow Horses is. Did you feel that after you'd written the 4th one in 2009, and I think you've returned to her in a few short stories since, but you stopped that and you then made that dramatic decision to start in evolving what became the Slow House series, and was that very conscious? You thought you'd gone as far as you could with that, and it still didn't represent exactly what you wanted to do as a novelist?
Sort of. I mean, I had written... My 4th novel, in fact, was separate from any of those series. It is a thriller called Reconstruction, which, in fact, I borrowed a couple of characters from it. They reappear later on in the Slough House world. But for me, writing Slow Horses was a very conscious change. And at that point, I was pretty sure that I was never going to write a bestseller, that I wasn't going to be a successful novelist in the commercial sense, which didn't matter to me very much. But it did give me a great deal of freedom. I thought that given that I don't have much of a readership and that my publisher, frankly, isn't that interested, I can do whatever I like. And that helped a lot in writing Slow Horses, because if you tried, this is back then, I started writing it in 2008. If back then I tried to pitch it, and I've never pitched a novel, I don't believe in pitching novels, if I tried to pitch it, reduced it to bullet points, it's about a lot of miserable people in a really horrible place who've been kicked out of their jobs and are working for a man who's really, really unpleasant. I don't think any publisher would have gone within a mile of it. And indeed, my then publisher didn't go within a mile of the second one. I was dropped after writing Slow Horses. But the intention had been that I would write Slow Horses and then go back and write another Zoe novel.
Oh, so it wasn't in your head, it wasn't a series?
It wasn't a series, it was a one-off. It was only when I got to the end of the book that I thought, actually, I want to stay in this world a bit longer. As it turns out, I've pretty much been there ever since. A couple of years ago, I put together a collection of short stories. Yeah. I haven't written very many short stories, and I haven't written any for quite a few years. And there were 3 or 4 Zoe stories there.
This is Dolphin Junction, is that?
Or Dolphin Junction, the collection is called. And one of those stories was written after Slow Horses. And I realised that I'd never really said goodbye to that character, because I'd always intended to return to her. And I haven't done so yet, but I do feel that I would like to revisit her in some way. And now, of course, seeing the wonderful Emma Thompson portraying her on screen and the fantastic Ruth Wilson doing Sarah, it does make me want to go back and spend some more time with those characters.
We might get
you might. I have a wish to do it. I don't have a plan. I have a wish.
And in terms of the series, obviously, in terms of the book series, you, as you said, you changed publishers. The book then...
I think publishers changed.
But you came back, and the series then started to gain a critical and commercial momentum throughout. And Fabio's been talking to you about things like language and perspective and dialogue. And I'm just really intrigued by this, because you have developed some really sophisticated kind of narrative techniques for the books. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, you mentioned earlier on plot and plot engines, and I think if we can we show the next slide, please? If we can put up the next slide. I think it's got now I don't know whether you can see that very clearly, but that's a kind of sketch of sort of the plot or the outline for a novel.
It was London Rules.
For London Rules.
London Rules.
And I just wondered, because Raymond Chandler famously said, when he was asked by Howard Hawks to explain a part of the plot of The Big Sleep and who killed who, and Raymond Chandler said to Howard Hawks, "I'm not really very good with plot, Howard. When I run into trouble, I have a couple of guys burst through a door and start shooting." And I just wondered, because actually your plots, and as you said earlier, you use real world situations, whether it's Brexit or the terrorist attacks in London, or now in the very latest English published novel Clown Town, you are talking about our current Prime Minister. So how is your attitude? Because you talk about dialogue, you talk about being inside the heads of your characters, but in terms of developing the slow horse universe, you must have quite a sophisticated knowledge of how that universe operates and how the plot mechanics will function.
Yes and no. Sorry, can I just go back to the Raymond Chandler?
Yeah.
I once read that in the middle of filming The Big Sleep, Hawks realised there was a hole in the plot, and he rang Chandler and said, "Who killed the chauffeur?"
Yeah.
And he woke Chandler up, apparently, and Chandler just said, "The butler did it," and went back to sleep. And half an hour later, the phone rang again, and Hawks said, "It can't have been the butler. The butler was in the summer house in Santa Monica." Chandler was never very bothered about plot dynamics. Nor am I. I mean, increasingly, I am using real-world events in the books, and I use those as kind of anchors to pin the plot down in the here and now, or in the year in which I'm writing. But for me, creating the plot around that is more a matter of style. And because I'm writing with a large bunch of characters now, I like to find different ways of getting the characters into the story, and different techniques for doing that. And most of that is just an attempt to make it more interesting for me, really. So I use things like stream of consciousness I've used in Clown Town, just a little bit. I did try writing an entire chapter like that, and it really didn't work. So what's survived of that are little snippets of it throughout a chapter that was radically rewritten. But that urge to do something different, to set challenges for myself in the writing of the books, is what makes it interesting for me. In writing Bad Actors, which hasn't yet been published in Italy, I adopted a sort of dramatic technique, you know, the sort of 3-act structure, which most classical drama adheres to. I put them in a different order. It's Act 2, Act 1, Act 3. But for Act 1, I wanted to write a single, uninterrupted piece of narrative. So it's 20-something thousand words long, and there are no breaks in it at all. It's all one flowing story. It goes from different consciousnesses. I mean, I changed points of view throughout, but it was all one unbroken stretch. And that, for me, was the main point of writing Bad Actors. Right. The plot is incidental to that challenge that I set myself in writing it.
And that's really interesting, because I also wanted to ask you about language and metaphor. We mentioned Chandler a few times, but as this is the Raymond Chandler Award, you know, one of the great things about Chandler, the literary great things about Chandler, is his use of simile, metaphor, and extreme metaphor. You know, the famous, was about as intricate, yes. And I feel in some ways, reading, you know, your writing, that there is a kinship there, that you enjoy that pleasure of that metaphorical use of language. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It was one of the joys of discovering Chandler for me, was that use of language which was literary, but using the demotic rather than using sort of highfalutin language, as he might have put it. So it was bringing the language of poetry down to the level of the streets, which is really what noir fiction is all about in many ways.
And in terms of let's sort of moving on, we're going to show a little tiny clip of Slow Horses in a second. But in terms of that translation, as you've talked in very complimentary terms, and there's a lovely article in the catalogue, which is I think the first Italian translation of an article that Mick wrote about, called Strange Game Indeed, about the process for Slow Horses being translated by Seesaw, paid for by Apple, into a television series. And it's a very amusing and interesting article. But what I was going to ask you is that before we talk about that and we show this clip is that what Slow Horses has, what Down Cemetery Road has, it has your comedy. And one of the great distinctions, I think, between you and lots of other noir writers, espionage writers, spy writers, is that there is a real sense of comedy. And you said you don't think about your characters visualizing them, but do you voice your jokes? Because there is so much comic dialogue in the books. You know, and Dickens famously used to act out his characters to a mirror. I'm not suggesting you do that, but do you read those aloud? Do you test whether the jokes work, Mick?
I don't read them literally aloud, but I was a sub-editor for many, many years, and one of the techniques that I learned was how to read aloud in my head, as it were. Right. Your eye doesn't skim over the page, your brain actually spells out each word. And I do that when I'm reading what I've written. And for me, jokes are obviously an important part of the text, especially an important part of the dialogue. But this is where the years I spent trying to be a poet, trying to write poetry, come in very handy, because writing verse, it's not just every word that counts, it's every syllable that counts. Writing comedy, every syllable counts as well. So when I come across a line that I've written, which I hope is going to raise a laugh, I try to make sure that there's no shorter way of saying that the shortest way possible of delivering the joke, that I've reached that point. Because the last thing you want is a long-winded joke. Long-winded jokes, if you can see the punchline coming, then they kind of stop being funny. You really want to get in there as swiftly as possible. So in an odd sort of way, the humour in the book, certainly the humour that resides in the dialogue, is me trying to be a poet.
And is there a real pleasure, we've talked about, Fabio asked you about Jackson Lamb, is there a real pleasure about the fact that you, because of the way in which you've created Jackson Lamb, he is the most unpolitically correct figure in contemporary crime fiction? Is there a real freedom that you can have him and other characters saying things that are completely unpolitically correct because of the way in which you anchor them in this extraordinary hostile world?
I think so. I think that's where it comes from. The great joy for me in writing Lamb, and I hope the pleasure that comes, if there is pleasure in reading him, comes from that unfiltered use of language that he uses. What I do hope is that people understand that he is not necessarily being sincere in the things that he says. He's saying them for effect. It doesn't happen so much anymore, but it used, when I first started being read widely, people assumed that Jackson Lamb was my mouthpiece and that I was essentially Lamb and that I believed in the things that he said and that I was an enemy of political correctness and woke behaviour. I am not. For me, political correctness is a matter of treating other people with respect and kindness, which is something that we should all do, and I am very much in favour of it. In inventing a character who is driven by self-loathing and giving him those things to say, in a sense, I'm pointing out, the absurdity and the way these attitudes eat themselves eventually. He is not meant to be an anti-woke warrior in any way. He is a man who is simply pleasing himself, amusing himself by being unpleasant to other people because it gets him through the day, essentially.
Let's see this clip from Slow Horses, which is about as un-PC as you can get. So let's just watch this little bit of this clip from Slow Horses, only a minute, and then we'll talk about the series.
That was almost entirely Will Smith, nothing to do with me.
Well, here's where I come back to the making of the show. As I say, you describe in lovely detail how the show got developed and bought and made. But I wanted then to ask you, you're not writing the scripts. Will Smith, the original showrunner, with a fantastic team, are creating that, individual directors for each series, James Hoare on the first series and so on and so forth. But you, I mean, apart from being an executive producer, you have been in the writer's room and spent time and got to know all of these people. And I just wondered, what do they come to you with? You know, when you're in the writer's room, is it about plot? Is it about dialogue? How does it work? Do they send you completed scripts? I'm just wondering about the degree to which they want you there to confirm that they're going in the right direction, particularly from the first series. You know, how did that work, the process with you and them?
I think you're largely right. What they're seeking is they're seeking my approval, which I find quite funny, really. Yes, they will come up with various ideas that they want to implement in creating the TV show, and they want to make sure that they're not treading on my toes by doing so, I think. I have always felt that they now have the right to do pretty much whatever they want within the confines of the world that they've already created. And the respect they're showing to the material is far more profound than I would have either expected or certainly required. What matters to me is that you retain the characters as they are on the page. I mean, they keep as close as possible to the characters as they were invented. And the cast in their entirety are doing that. They're all looking... Well, the scriptwriters first, but also the cast have both taken the development of these characters from how they appeared on the page. There are physical differences, obviously. That's always going to happen. But the profound nature of those characters remains as I originally intended. And that is the only thing that matters. As far as I'm concerned, the plots we've already discussed, you know, my feeling of where I place plots on the priority, it's quite low down. So none of that matters to me at all. What they do want is really just to make sure that I'm okay with the way they're producing things. And also when they put in bits that I didn't create, that aren't coming from the book, they just want to make sure that I don't feel that they're tonally jarring. What is quite amusing to me when I look back on it is that when they started writing Slow Horses, the very first season based on my book Slow Horses, it had been more than 10 years since I wrote the book. And they'd spent a year immersed in it before I was invited along, before they set up the writer's room, and I was invited along. And we were discussing how the plot would go, and somebody said, oh, well, at this particular point, this is where Jackson says to River, whatever it is, delivers a line of dialogue. And I sat back in my chair and I thought, you know, that doesn't really sound to me like something that Jackson Lamb would say. And they all stared at me, and somebody said, Mick, it's in the book. So in many ways, they're far more connected to the material than I am, because I write something, I publish it, and I essentially put it behind me. I have to keep up occasionally. I have to look back at what I've written just to make sure that I'm not going way off beam or you know, lack of continuity or something.
Yes.
But they're kind of in daily touch with the books now in a way that I'm not.
But it is amazing, because I you know, watching the series, I can hear your dialogue. You know, it very clearly they do use a huge amount of it, and you've had cameos. I think you and Joe have both actually been in the Hitchcock-like cameos.
Yeah. Yes, we've made 3, I think, and one in Down Cemetery Road as well. The third one hasn't been seen yet. We appear quite fleetingly. We spent an entire afternoon, I think I write about this in that article you mentioned, filming a scene in which we come out of a Chinese restaurant. And if you blink, you will miss it. We did spend a similar long time coming out of a hotel and hailing a taxi. I do that. I do my own stunts. That's me hailing a taxi. Outside, now, taxis are screaming to a halt because I just did that. And again, on screen, it's over very quickly. And if you're not looking for us, you might not see us. But in the third one we've done for Slow Horses, We're sitting next to Christian Scott Thomas at a memorial service, and the camera lingers on Christian Scott Thomas, rightly so, I should say. And because I'm sitting right next to her, it also lingers on me, so we'll be much more visible in season 6, I think it is.
We'll look out for that. Let's move on to Down Cemetery Road and briefly talk about the TV series. But before we do, let's see this. You've seen the trailer, but let's see this lovely clip of Emma Thompson reciting a very famous extract from a very famous poem. So let's see this final clip, please. And in terms of that, and Philip Larkin there, but the series, as you said earlier on when we were talking about the novel, the first novel, Zoe Bem isn't the main character of the book at all. It's the Ruth Wilson character in the book. But obviously, Morwenna Banks, who sort of was one of the writers of Slow Horses, working with Will Smith, the showrunner, now has, and she's obviously, I know she's a friend of yours, she's moved across into the different production company to be the showrunner and lead writer on Down Cemetery Road. And I have to say, I think they've done a fantastic job. But that seems to have had more profound rewriting because of the whole Zoe backstory that isn't in what is only obliquely referred to in your novel. So that must have been quite a profound change for you to see that.
Yeah, there's quite a strong difference between the book and the TV show. It's the same plot, but Zoe is involved right from the start in a way that she isn't in the book. Watching that clip made me realise for the first time why they put that in. The title of the book, as you probably know, is from that poem by Philip Larkin, who's I'm a huge admirer of his writings. And there was talk for a long, long time, up until quite a late stage. Apple were worried about the title. They didn't really want to call it Down Cemetery Road because they thought it sounded like a horror story. And they thought that people would imagine it was going to be something else. And they caved in the end, largely because nobody could think of another idea. And I think they put that in just to explain why it is called Down Cemetery Road, for those people who aren't familiar with the works of Philip Larkin. Morwenna had to make quite a lot of changes, and we did spend a fair bit of time talking about it. But the changes that she's wrought, it's really interesting to me to work with somebody who is an expert in that other medium. I'm not a screenwriter. As you say, I work on the page. When I wrote Sarah, I wrote her as a character who was, her job was as an editor. She was a freelance editor, working pretty much like I was at the time, with words on a page. Yeah. Morwenna made her an art restorer, which is obviously a much more visual medium, because then they can put it on screen and they can show her doing something and you can look at it and you can see what she's doing. If we'd just shown her kind of sitting at a laptop or working on a page, that would have been so tedious. It would have been very, very boring. There would have been no way of conveying really the nature of the work she's doing to an audience and make it interesting. Mm. But when she's working with the opening scene of Down Cemetery Road is her looking at a painting and working on a painting, and that is something that the audience can immediately connect with because they're doing exactly the same thing. They're looking at a picture on the screen. So it's little things like that which would never have occurred to me that Morwenna has brought to it, which have really made it live on screen.
I mean, I think it's a terrific adaptation, but I just, sort of a couple of last questions before we open it more generally. But you've said repeatedly you're a novelist. I mean, a lot of famous novelists, a lot of, whether it's, Graham Greene or whether it's Elmer Leonard or it's, George V. Lots of them have had adventures in the screen trade, writing adaptations of their own work, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. We talked about Chandler, had a long career writing for Paramount. But it seems to me to be quite clear you have never wanted to be the adapter of your own work for screen. Is that because you just think it's a completely different trade and a distraction, and you think there are other people better, or it's something you never thought, I'd really like to have a go at that?
I'm torn. I mean, in a way, I would quite like to have a go at it. But if I did, I would go from being quite good at what I do, because I've done it for a long time, to being an absolute novice and having to start right from scratch and being less good at it than people who've never had the kind of career success that I've had in that other medium. I remember reading once that I think this happens in Canada, the air guitar championships. Has anybody heard of that? Yes. Where people pretend to play the electric guitar, and there's a competition to see who the best in the world at pretending to play a guitar is. And I read a report of this in the newspaper, and some guy, I think he might have been a Canadian, there's not a lot else to do there, I believe, he became the world's best air guitar player by being given this award. And he was asked what he was going to do next, and he said, well, actually, I'm going to buy a guitar and start playing real guitar. And so he's going to go from being the very, very best in the world at pretending to play the guitar to being one of the worst in the world at playing a guitar, because he'd never done it before. I think it would be a bit like that with me if I went on to screencast.
So if you're not going to immediately do that, I mean, I personally hope, I mean, we know there's going to be more Slow Horses. Series 6 is going to be on here next year. Series 5 is on at the moment. Series 6 next year. Series 7 shooting in London as we speak. So there's more Slow Horses coming. You said you may return to Zoe on the page. I hope there's another Down Cemetery Road series coming, because there's 3 more novels. So, that would be fantastic. I presume the plans for that are still not determined.
Not determined yet.
Yeah. And we've obviously, in the UK, had a new novel published in English, Clowntown. So you're not finished with Slow Horses, and you said it up there, you're not finished with the Slow Horses world yet either.
No. I'm writing something different at the moment, which will take me most of next year, I think. But I hope that come the year after that, I'll start writing another Slough House novel. Yeah.
And on that, can we just show the last slide? Because there's a nice slide of Mick with there's Mick on set with Gary,
that is me telling Gary Oldman that the book I'm working on is called Bad Actors. I was quite nervous about that. He took it quite well, as you can see.
Well, congratulations again on the award, and congratulations on all of this fantastic achievement. It's wonderful to have you here with us talking about this work. I'm going to open it back up again now, but thank you very much, Mick Herron.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you all. Thank you.
And I invite you all to the meeting with the author, and we will be presenting the last book published in Italy by Feltrinelli, London Rules, Le regole di Londra, at 6 p.m. today a Casa di Manzoni. Matteo Persivale is a journalist who will introduce the book. So,
vogliamo domandare se qualcuno
se ci
del
sono delle
pubblico
domande, certo.
vuole impadronirsi di questo microfono, e arriva il microfono.
Wants to have questions.
Buongiorno.
Naturalmente sarebbe meglio farla in inglese, se potete, perché c'è la traduttrice simultanea.
Okay. I think James Bond is one of the most significant character in spy fiction. And I ask to you, Jackson Lamb is very different. But why Jackson Lamb has to be so different from James Bond?
But they are very different. Bond's role, certainly in the novels, I think he's romanticised a bit in the movies. probably just as well. In the books, he's essentially a paid assassin. He goes around the world killing people who are enemies of the UK government. So he's just a man doing the job that he's been assigned to do. And so is Jackson Lamb. It's just that his job is a very different one. His part of life that's taken place in Slough House, his job is just to make the lives of those around him miserable. That's actually what he's there for. And so that's what he does with a great deal of enjoyment, as you can see from Gary's performance in that last clip. He is a man who has... his past is not covered very much in the books, but he's obviously someone who's seen action, who's seen damage, who has been damaged, and he is full of self-loathing because of it. I'm really writing about somebody who has had a career in which he's either done or witnessed some quite terrible things, and this is what it's made him. It's really a study in post-traumatic stress as much as anything else. But he's a man who is allowing himself the freedom to express his self-loathing and to express his disregard for other people in a way that I wouldn't recommend any of us really try in real life.
No more than a couple of more questions.
Morning, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
You mentioned the shock for the Brexit, and it seems to me that all the characters in your novel, I mean, Slow Horses Saga, they are facing failure, they are in some way defeats from life events. So how much important is failure for you, for the characters in the life?
Very much so. I mean, it is one of the key themes of the novels as a whole. I'm much more interested in failure than I am in success, because it allows me as a writer access to the characters in a way that success doesn't, and to readers too. If I wrote about a very happy person who had plenty of money and no big problems and a nice house to live in, I, as a writer, and you all as readers, would get bored with that very, very quickly. Why do you want to read about somebody who is just content with life? Writing about failure, writing about people who have been thwarted in one way or another, allows everybody to empathise, I think, because we've all been to places we don't necessarily want to go. Many of us have, ended up in jobs alongside people we don't want to work with. We've all had ambitions that we've never quite realised. So there's that automatic opportunity to empathise with characters because of that. I just think failure is more interesting. We're all heroic because we cope with our own failures, I think. Whereas people who have never failed probably haven't really lived. They probably never dared very much, I think. More.
I was saying that could be a good suggestion for the students as well.
Oh, well, of course, of course.
and is Kafka, I mean, because obviously you have them doing it is a satire of office life, but you have them doing, Jackson has them doing the most horrifically horrible bureaucratic tasks. And it does seem to channel Kafka in a certain way in terms of the environment of Slough House.
Automatically does that, yes. I think anything which is, among other things, a study in bureaucracy or a look at how red tape, I don't know whether that phrase exists in Italian, how red tape works, is automatically channeling Kafka. And I've never read very much Kafka, but that's one of the ways in which a writer like Kafka has just changed the culture. I mean, it's become part of the culture in a way that is totally unavoidable. Yeah.
There are more questions? I don't know. One question.
Last one.
The very last one.
I am amazed that in your novels you always show a very deep knowledge of British politics. And that you are very familiar even of the dark side of British politics. Do you reserve a lot of your time reading or studying about contemporary British politics for your books?
I spend a lot of my time trying to ignore contemporary British politics. What we just said about failure and despair, this is pretty much the mode in which we're operating in the UK at the moment. I don't have any special knowledge. I don't do a great deal of research. I pay attention to what's going on in as much as, reading headlines and listening to news reports. But when it comes to writing, I just take as bleak a view as possible and assume that I'm going to be more or less correct. In terms of what goes on behind closed doors, I just imagine the worst. I really do think that that is how things happen now. Not always, and it's not as it should be, but I think it's what's going on at the moment, and has been for some time.
So we learned that bureaucracy kills and that politics has to be ignored to survive. So, lo dico in italiano. Io ringrazio, I thank Mick Herron, Adrian Wootton, and also Marina Fabbri, Giorgio Cosetti per aver organizzato questo evento. Vi ricordo l'appuntamento di oggi pomeriggio alle 18 a Casa Manzoni per la presentazione di London Rules, le regole di Londra, e grazie a voi, grazie a tutti i tecnici che hanno collaborato e ci vediamo presto.
Thank you all, and thank you Carla for doing the translating.